The drunkard who heard Seo Jihak's threats was terrified and crawled away from the girl. The young lord put his sword to the man's throat and looked at the frightened girl frozen against the wall. Seo Jihak said that she looked a lot like a scaredy girl he knew, so he was afraid that a man was harassing her. And then he swung his sword and blood spurted in different directions. Yongi crouched on the ground with chilling horror and stared at him with eyes full of fear. The girl thought she was next in line. Seo Jihak looked down at her and said that her eyes were as frightened as that girl's, but otherwise they were completely different. Yulja suddenly appeared and turned to his master. He handed him the stick and told him that he had forgotten about it. The man accepted this and grinned, saying he had completely forgotten he had to play the part of the blind man. Without another word, the men turned and walked away, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. Unha was sitting and carefully reading one of the books she was to read to the young lord. The more she read, the more she became afraid. They could execute her for such literature. But she was so interested she couldn't stop herself. Suddenly, she heard a light knock and the voice of Yulia, who said that the master had ordered her to be brought to him. He told her to take her books with her and follow him to the bathing house. Seo Jihak enjoyed the hot water while taking a bath. The water ran down his wet hair and body, and he looked like an ancient god. He was listening so intently to the girl's reading that it was even a little disconcerting. Una sat with her back to him so she wouldn't be distracted from reading to look at him. Suddenly, interest prevailed over her, and she furtively turned round, seeing his broad chest and embossed arms. The girl immediately turned away and wondered why he had called her while he was bathing. Pensive, she stopped reading as suddenly a few drops of water fell on the book. The girl raised her head. The man stretched his arm forward and said that she usually talked a lot, but for some reason she was suddenly as quiet as a mouse. He propped his fist on his head and leaned towards her, wondering if anything had happened to her while he was away. The girl immediately blushed. She put the back of her palm to her burning cheek and said she never talked much. The prince smirked, and while the girl didn't notice, intently regarded her. Suddenly, the man stretched out his arm and asked the girl to rub his shoulders. Una left the book and sat down closer to the man. While she was gently rubbing his hands, she plucked up the courage to say that the young lord had allowed himself to drink too much last night. The man replied that he felt suffocated, to which the girl replied that he might regret this attitude towards drinking. Seo Jihak suddenly stood up and turned around to lean on the girl. He leaned his head against her chest and said that she smelled so refreshing for him. Then he slowly began to turn around, inhaling her scent, and said that unlike other people smelling of greed and vice, the girl exuded a sweet fragrance. Suddenly, he put his hand round the back of her head and kissed her tenderly. Contrary to his fears, the girl was not frightened and did not push him away, but answered him timidly. Only breathing frequently, she put her hand on his chest and raised her full, innocent gaze to his. She pressed her other hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart, and asked him why he was doing that. Suddenly, the sight of her innocent eyes triggered a horrible memory in his mind. The man stood up and left their font, ordering the girl to go to her chambers to rest. Seo Jihak was already putting on his dressing gown when he heard the girl's voice. She asked if the man was really blind or faking it. Unha admitted that she feels like he can see every emotion on her face, and she feels like he's constantly watching her. The man started to tie his dressing gown and asked why she thought so and if she was upset that he was blind. The girl ran up and grabbed the ribbons to help him. She apologized for being rude. While Unha was helping to tie his dressing gown, she said that his clothes are completely transparent and other people can see his body. Seo Jihak asked, "Doesn't she like what she sees?" The girl was embarrassed and replied that she was just worried about his dignity. Suddenly, the man intercepted her wrists and pulled her against him, saying that if there was a concept unknown to him, it was definitely shame. He confessed to the girl that she was now holding the hand of the most shameless man. Una asked if that meant why he had kissed her. The man kept his gaze on her and then replied that he just wanted to taste what was his. Hearing this, Una was embarrassed and asked to be let go, but the man loomed over her and asked if she hated him after that or was afraid of him. He ran his nose over her palm and admitted that she was a delight to him. The next day, Yunha was sitting on the doorstep of the hanok and started coughing. She was worried she had a cold because she went to bed last night with wet hair. Suddenly, Harim ran up to her and asked why she was sitting alone and bored. The young man said he'd been looking all over for her and then reached into his breast pocket and pulled out something folded into a handkerchief. They were fresh rice cakes with her favorite syrup. The girl was delighted. So the guy wanted to thank her for her kindness, but suddenly he felt something and ordered the girl to duck. He put the handkerchief with the sweets in her hands and told her to get as far away as possible. There was a very poisonous snake in the grass, which for some reason crawled over to the hanok. The guy was about to catch it and release it outside the house, but suddenly the snake hissed and bared its fangs and made a lunge. Horim hissed in pain and pressed his bloody hand against his own. Una crouched beside him and told him that they needed to get rid of the poison and treat the wound immediately. The girl rolled up his sleeve and brought his hand to her mouth, about to suck out the poison. Suddenly, Seojihak's voice came out and asked sternly what the two of them were doing here. The girl looked at him in confusion. Hearing the young lord's voice, Yoonha looked at him with horror. The girl saw him draw his sword from Yulia's sheath and swing it in their direction. There was a whistle of metal, and the girl clenched and clutched her eyes shut. After a moment, she stared at the severed head of the snake. Seo Jihak, holding a sword in his hand, told Yulia to better train the warriors. It's a shame that one of them wasn't able to get rid of a ridiculous threat like a snake. Later, the young gentleman, accompanied by Yoonha, went down to the village to walk through the market. Holding the girl's hand, he felt that she was hot and asked if she had a cold, to which the girl replied vaguely. She couldn't get rid of the thought of what had happened before. She thought about the fact that he drew his sword so confidently and decapitated the snake as if he knew exactly where it was. It made Yoonha doubt that he was really blind. But even if he wasn't, she couldn't help but obey him, and the man knew it all too well. As they walked through the market, the girl felt responsible for leaving Horim behind after he tried to protect her. But she couldn't help but go with the Lord. Suddenly, her musings were interrupted when she felt a comb being inserted into her hair. The girl froze in place. While Yoonha looked at the young lord in embarrassment, he was talking to the saleswoman as if nothing had happened. The woman kept offering him beautiful combs that a girl might like. Seo Jihak smiled, looking at the girl, and said that since he couldn't see how they would look on her, she could choose one she liked. The girl immediately blushed and said he shouldn't give any gifts of any kind. The man leaned down to her face and looked at her as if he could see her every feature, and said that he wanted her to wear his gift every time she read to him. Una tried to argue that he wouldn't be able to see it anyway, but the man reached out and stroked her head, touching the crest, and then replied that he could always reach out to her and feel it with his touch. He asked not to fear him or hate him, and the girl immediately remembered his behavior yesterday. She took and looked at the beautiful comb in the form of a bouquet of roses and pearls, and thought that he probably wanted to ask for her forgiveness in this way. Seo Jihak immediately appeared beside her, asking if she liked something. She thought he was watching her again. They ended up buying a whole bunch of jewelry and moved on. In a crowded place, the man had difficulty using his cane. He asked permission to lean on the girl and put his arm around her to make it easier for her to guide him along the way. Una eagerly responded, but suddenly coughed violently. The young lord said worriedly that the girl seemed to have a cold, though she had been quite well the night before. They continued on their way at a leisurely pace. Suddenly, Una heard a familiar voice calling her by name. It was a young Yoon lord. He ran up to them and asked what the girl was doing in this place. Then the men's gazes crossed. Seo Jihak looked at the young man with a sly smirk. Yoon saw the lord in rich clothes and holding a cane, and wondered if he could be the blind prince. The young man grabbed the girl's arm and asked if her sister knew where she was and what she was doing now. Completely ignoring him, Seo Jihak gently took the girl's chin and said that she seemed to have a fever, just like he had yesterday. Then he added that she'd gotten too wet in front of him yesterday and grinned slyly. The girl froze and blushed as she realized how ambiguous that might sound. He strode forward and told her to hurry home, then he could personally take care of her and her health. When the girl tried to object, he threw over his shoulder so she wouldn't try to ruin his good mood. Yoon, who had been so unceremoniously ignored, was angry and glared menacingly at the insolent man. Una gently took her palm out of his hands and apologized, saying that she would write him a letter later, but now she had to leave. As she left, the girl turned round several times to look at her friend, who was standing in a daze. Finally, Yoon turned around and saw the girl arguing heatedly with the young lord. From the outside, it looked like the two of them were quite close. He clenched his fists angrily, anger and envy clouding his eyes. He thought about how dare the bastard touch his Yoonha. Young Lord Yoon poisoned his man to follow Yoonha, and his suspicions were confirmed. The man reported that she had indeed gone to the prince's private residence. He also revealed that he had heard rumors that the prince had hired a Jongasi, but did not expect it to turn out to be Yoonha. The young lord listened to him, and his excitement grew. The man continued to report that he had learned that the young lord's mother had made a deal with Yoongi to keep her sister away from Yoon. Yoongi also said that the prince was stirring up trouble in the Buyongan, and asked if the young lord's father had told him why the prince had come before. but Yoon only knew that he had come to thank his father and nothing else. The young man asked the man to keep an eye on Eunha, and the man said it would be no trouble at all. Yoon glanced at the picture with the poem that Eunha had written for him and told the man that he was very interested in who this man was, the abandoned Prince Hayeon. Later, left alone, Yoon burned with jealousy and remembering the words that the blind prince had thrown at the market, wanted to release the tension. His mind vividly drew pictures of this man taking advantage of her. Breathing heavily, he clutched his hand tightly and felt a release. The young man was physically relieved, but his mind was still swarming with thoughts of how dare that blind bastard trespass on what was his own. He pressed his head against the wall, recovering his breaths and continuing to hold himself with one hand and whispering that Eunha should never have left him. At this time, Eunha, who was still feverish, tried to persuade Gari to bring her some writing utensils so she could write a letter. But the girl flatly refused, saying that Eunha needed to sleep and recover. The girl's head was in a fog as she listened to Gari berate her for wandering around with a fever. The girl said Eunha should sleep, then she'll recover faster. Just as she closed her eyes, Seo Ji-hak quietly crept into the room and stared at her intently. Gari didn't have time to open her mouth before he gestured for her to remain silent. It was not worth disturbing the already fragile sleep of a sick person. Una lay with a wet bandage on her forehead and was breathing heavily. The man made sure she was looked after and left. It was late in the evening. Seo Ji-hak smoked a kisara and pondered how someone who could kill a mountain tiger could so easily come down with a common cold. Then he remembered the young guy, the son of the main Kisang, who hasn't even started to mature. His gaze full of jealousy that he had kept on him and Eunha. The man wanted to laugh right there on the spot. He exhaled smoke, smirking as one of the local lords approached him. He apologized for the late visit. Seo Ji-hak replied that he didn't bother him at all, especially since they failed to meet when he visited Buyongan a few days ago. What a surprise that the lords who were supposed to guard the borders of their lands gathered in one place as if they were waiting for the prince's arrival. The man smiled nervously and said that it was indeed an amazing coincidence. He thought to himself that while he had a chance, he should see if the prince was really blind. He stepped forward and waved his hand in front of the prince's face, saying that while the prince was in these lands and recovering his health, he could be his loyal companion. When Seo Ji-hak didn't react, not even blinking, the man thought he was probably really blind. So he decided it was okay to disregard etiquette and leaned on the table with a snide smirk and said that he had heard rumors that the prince had hired himself a jonggesu. Seo Ji-hak maintained an impenetrable gaze and listened intently to the man. The man moved even closer and said he had brought some very interesting books with him and asked if the prince could call this girl to read for them. Seo Ji-hak ordered Yulje to send for Eunha. Surprised by this order, the man tried to object as he knew the girl was unconscious from fever, but the prince told him to wake her up by pouring water on her face. The prince propped his chin up with his hand and smirked and said that his friend the lord wished to hear the voice of Princess jonggesu. After a long time, the indignant man walked through the grounds of the residence. The prince said he would be gone for a while, and the man nearly died of cold waiting for his return. He walked and thought about how he had been left alone at the table like a fool and cursed quietly to himself. Suddenly, he heard a man and a girl talking about the health of a certain girl. The man hid behind the wall of a nearby building and overheard a conversation that the girl was feverish and would need a few days to recover. It was the prince's steward who asked if he had given any instructions concerning her, to which the girl replied that the prince had previously visited the sick girl and ordered her to be well cared for. The man asked her to go away with him for a while. The elderly lord grinned slyly, pleased that he'd had the opportunity to do so. He started sneaking towards the prince's private room. He wondered who he was hiding in there. Opening the door of the hanok, the man froze in place and could not believe his eyes. The man saw a beautiful young girl who was sound asleep. She didn't look like a noble girl. Did the prince care for a commoner? Drooling, the old lord said that the girl was very beautiful, her skin soft and her lips scarlet. At least the prince has good taste in girls. He would have loved to taste that honey skin. Suddenly, Seo Ji-hak's voice rang out above his ear as he thanked him for appreciating his taste. The man stared at the prince in horror, not expecting to see him at this moment. Pretending not to notice his confusion, the prince took a closer look at the girl and, scratching his chin, reported that he thought the girl's skin was nothing extraordinary. The elderly lord relaxed as the prince didn't look angry and continued drooling and assured him that this girl's skin looked as pure and soft as silk. He assured Seo Ji-hak that such a cute girl would be hard to find even after searching all the Kiseng houses in the empire. The prince watched the man and asked if he really thought so. Without noticing anything, the elderly lord became aroused and began to tell the man how much pleasure he would have in spending time with this girl right now. Seo Ji-hak straightened up, a menacing smirk on his face, and said that he had bought this girl to read books to him. But unfortunately, she was unable to do so now. When the lord, without taking his eyes off the sleeping girl, said that he could read to the prince at any time, he felt his head being grabbed and squeezed hard. The prince replied that from that moment the man would not be able even to speak. Seo Ji-hak grabbed him by the bundle on his head and dragged him down the steps and threw the man to the ground. The man started screaming in fear. Falling down and covering his head with his hands, the lord stared at the prince in bewilderment. Suddenly, he saw his reflection in the prince's mad eyes. Seo Ji-hak smirked and asked what he was willing to lose first, his eyes or his tongue. The young man walked up to the insolent man and grabbed him by the hair and looked him straight in the eye. It became clear that he was not blind. He came closer and hissed in his face that the bastard had no right to want what belonged to the prince, and that he would feed him to the dogs for it. Having finished with the elderly libertine, the man entered the room and gently took Yunha in his arms. The girl briefly regained consciousness, but saw everything blurred and felt everything as if in a fog. She thought she could see Seo Ji-hak's face, but she had the strength for nothing but quiet sighs. Then she felt strong arms and warmth. The girl leaned her head against his chest and felt cozy. Soon, Seo Ji-hak lowered himself into the hot water font with her, holding her so she wouldn't fall. He thought about how strange things had turned out. Every time he saw her and heard her voice, he couldn't imagine that he would ever lose her. The man began to gently pour water over her, washing her body. His thoughts revolved around the fact that if she had been from a noble family, they would have met in the palace long ago. But her presence here was very useful to him, for it would have been difficult for him to deal with such a heavy language on his own. The more he looked at the girl, the more tempted he became. He wanted to possess her body and soul. She reminded him of a fawn he'd had as a child. He took care of it with his own hands. Suddenly, the girl groaned, began to speak softly, addressing him. She managed to open her eyes and weakly turned her head in his direction. The girl asked what they were doing here. She was worried that someone might see them and misunderstand, but the man hugged her tighter and reassured her that no one would bother them. Una's cheeks were red and she was still feverish. She quietly breathed out the young lord's name. Seo Ji-hak leaned down, almost touching her lips, and asked, "Is she imagining him even when she is burning from the high temperature?" A cocky and smug smile graced his lips as he demanded an answer from the girl. Una's mind was clouded by illness, but she tried to object, saying she didn't allow herself to think about him too much. The man pressed his lips together, his male ego having been slightly damaged. Then he told the girl to think of the person she would like to see by her side, and Yuna sighed deeply and replied that there was such a person. Seo Ji-hak said to the girl, "Relax and keep the image of this man in her head." The girl lost consciousness for a while, and when she came round again, she saw the face of the young gentleman in front of her. She thought she was asleep. She felt light in her body and warm at the same time. The water gently enveloped her, and the man gently poured warm jets over her. He whispered soothing words in her ear. Soon, she felt his hands begin to roam her body. A sly smile played on his face, and he said that he would help her body relax so that she could fall into a deep sleep afterwards. His touch was soft and sure, until suddenly a wave of pleasure flooded the girl, and the world around her disappeared for her. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was Seo Ji-hak contentedly licking his fingers. At that moment, she was sure that everything that was happening was a dream. A few days later, Yuna could barely open her eyes, trying to figure out where she was. At that moment, Gari entered the room and, seeing that the girl had regained consciousness, rushed towards her. She said that Yunha had been unconscious for 5 days and asked how she was feeling. The girl smiled and said she felt perfectly healthy. She did feel rested. Then her gaze fell on the trays of food, and Gari told her that the young lord had ordered that she should have the most delicious food when she regained consciousness. Then she drew close to the girl and said she had never seen a lord so favorable to anyone before. Not only did he personally come to feed her and give her medicine, the man also personally took her to the washroom and washed her body in person. Hearing this, Una immediately remembered her strange dream, but she couldn't believe that this could really happen. The girl muttered that even if it was a dream, it was very inappropriate for her. Gari, who didn't understand anything, asked what the girl was talking about. but she immediately blushed and replied that she was just thinking in her head. Una asked how Horium was feeling, and the girl replied that he was fine and was patrolling the villa. Then she remembered that she had a letter for Unha and reached into her pocket for it. Gari said the man introduced himself as a bookstore owner and asked her to give her a letter. The girl opened it with interest and immediately recognized Mr. Song's handwriting. When the girl read the first lines, she was horrified. He wrote that there were bad rumors among the people about her sister. Recently, the lord who was going to make Yongi his concubine suddenly disappeared, having quarreled with her the day before, and soon the body of a mutilated old man was found outside the town. But he was more concerned that people a couple of days ago had seen young Lord Yoon grab Yongi and very roughly drag her somewhere with an angry expression on his face. Yongi was walking through the narrow streets covering her yogori head when suddenly someone's hand roughly grabbed her and dragged her somewhere else. Young Lord Yoon turned around to face her and angrily said that it seemed the rumors about her were correct. The girl stared at him in despair. She knew she was accused of what had happened to the elderly lord, so she had to go into hiding. Seeing the state she was in, her face scratched and her clothes stained, the young man asked if it was true that the lord had tried to harm her. The girl could only nod her head slightly, and Yoon ordered her to follow him. He brought the girl into his house. Yoongi said that he shouldn't have done that because if anyone found out that he brought Kisang into his house, there would be bad rumors about him. The young man only replied that he didn't care about any rumors, and the girl lowered her head obediently. He said the old man who harassed her already had 5 concubines. He did not know how his mother had managed to settle the matter, but he knew for sure that no one in town was now looking for Yoongi. Yoon looked angrily at the girl and said that no one would care now which house she would live in as a concubine. The girl stared at him blankly and then asked if he was doing it for Yuna's sake and not because he felt sorry for her. She lowered her gaze again and said she was worried that her little sister might do something stupid in her desire to help her. Suddenly, the man turned round and loomed over her with a menacing shadow. He hissed angrily that she was to blame for everything that had happened to him and Una, that she had always been an obstacle in their way. He grabbed the girl by the shoulders and shouted that not only was she unable to keep her sister close to her, but she had condemned her to the fate of becoming an ordinary kisang. He kept shaking her by the shoulders and blaming her for the fact that his mother had managed to talk her into sell her body instead of waiting until he could buy them both off. Yongi, in tears, tried to explain that the elder Kizang knew about the young lord's feelings for Unha, and for a man of his status, it was unacceptable. He should forget about her. The man interrupted her by loudly ordering her to shut up. Exhaling, he calmly said that the girl had captured his heart when they were children, so he took her under his wing, taught her everything, and hoped to give her a chance to be adopted by a good family so he could then marry her and make her his own. He spent 10 years on it until Yongi messed it up. So since she and her sister have practically the same face, he said that she dare not speak to him like that, and suddenly kissed the crying girl. Feeling herself in strong masculine hands, the girl calmed down and dropped her yoguri. When the man recoiled from her, the girl claimed he might hate her. She was used to living with resentment. Yongi knew she wasn't as good as her sister and not worthy of her, but she was willing to do anything to keep her safe. The young lord's eyes lit up with a mad glint, and he asked if she would take her sister's place if she was so worried that his feelings for Unha might hurt her. Yongi, who had not expected such a thing, froze and stared at the young lord in incomprehension. Suddenly, in a voice cold as steel, the man ordered the girl to help him undress. He grabbed her hand and said that if she tried hard enough, maybe he could forget Una. Yongi obediently pulled at the ribbon of his hanbok, and unfastening it, the girl saw a taut, muscular body. Yoon looked smugly at the girl's embarrassment. As the girl lowered her hands to the ties on his paji, the young man stopped her and gently lifted her chin. He looked into her big eyes and her so familiar face, but it was still not Una's. Suddenly, he abruptly turned her back to him and pressed her against the wall, telling her not to turn round. The girl asked in fear what he was up to, but Yoon ignored her question and said that he had bad blood in his veins because he had been the product of sinful behavior from the start. She was a sinner who went to the bottom to protect her little sister. So wouldn't they be a good match for each other? With these words, the man began to lift the girl's skirts. Young-hee walked around young Lord Yoon's house, where muffled moans were coming from, and thought that maybe he could go home now. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't immediately notice the elder lord's appearance. Yoon's father stepped closer with a nonchalant face, and the young man bowed to him. There were still moans coming from the house, and the older man asked a mute question looking at the lad. Young-hee didn't know what to say and began to mumble inarticulately. The man walked on and ordered afterwards to bring this girl to him. Young-hee rubbed his neck in embarrassment and thought about the fact that someone was going to be in trouble soon. Seo Ji-hak recalled convincing his younger brother that he had a birthright to the throne. There were many rumors going around, but the boy had to ignore them and go to his destiny. The conversation was interrupted by one of the lords who had come to fetch Seo Ji-hak. The man, too, had to follow his destiny and fulfill his duty. He was to be a shadow warrior who would be capable of leading an army. Seo Ji-hak exhaled smoke from Kiseng when his memories were interrupted by Yuljae. A man reported that one of the lords had died. This will increase the number of observers around the prince and the number of assassination attempts. Seo Ji-hak smirked and said that was what he had hoped for. He wants the lords to doubt him, so he can keep them under control while their hearts are full of fear because they don't know the answer to their questions. Or at least until his younger brother is safely on the throne. Yulia said that Unha also wanted to see the lord. The man smirked and said he wasn't surprised. The girl had probably already heard the trouble her sister was in. He ordered Yulia to let her in and leave, closing the door behind him. The man opened the doors of the room and found Unha immediately in front of them. He silently let the girl inside and closed the doors tightly behind him. The girl timidly entered and, having greeted the lord, quickly lowered her head. Seo Ji-hak was in no hurry to turn around. Una apologized for the inconvenience and asked if she could go into town for a while. The man glanced at her with a nonchalant expression and pretended not to understand why she wanted to do it. He folded his arms across his chest and asked where she was going, for her health was not yet back to normal. The girl was embarrassed and said that she had already recovered. She was also told how the lord had taken care of her, and she thanked him for that. Suddenly, the man turned round and approached the girl, asking her how she could be so mean to him every time. Unha stared at him incomprehensibly. Seo Ji-hak stretched out his arms to embrace the girl and said that if she came to him to ask for something, she should put on a nice dress and smile gently. He ran his hand over her cheek and said that all she had to do was just whisper a plea to him to help her. It was late at night when Unha looked back at the villa and ran through the forest towards the town. At last, the lord told her that if she wished to do foolish things, he could not keep her from doing so. He gave her until dawn, so she should have hurried. Once at Mr. Song's door, the girl knocked and, panting, apologized for coming later than he expected. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice, and without waiting for an answer, she swung the door open. The girl saw her sister standing there talking to the old man and couldn't believe her happiness. Mr. Song said that it's really lucky that the girl came because Yonggi just came to ask to write a letter for her. Seeing her sister's face, all scratched up, Yunha gently took it in her hands and tearfully asked what had happened to her. Yonggi, choking on her tears, couldn't utter a word. The girl felt guilty because while her thoughts were occupied with the young lord and his sweet talk, she began to forget the cruel reality in which her older sister lived. She blushed and could only say that she was so stupid and that she was sorry. Yonggi began to wipe away her sister's tears and reassure her that Lord Yoon had taken care of her. She doesn't have to become that old man's concubine. Mr. Song decided to leave the sisters alone so they could talk to each other. As Una continued to shed tears, her sister affectionately stroked the girl's cheek and tried to comfort her. She asked her why she had lost so much weight. But was it because she was worried about her neglectful older sister? Suddenly, Yonggi suggested that she run away together if the girl no longer had the strength to endure any longer. She started stroking her sister and saying that the two of them could run away together to a place where no one knows them and start over, without pain and suffering. Una bit her lower lip and looked at her brave older sister. And then she pitched forward sharply and held her tightly against him. The girl crouched on the floor without opening her embrace and silently shed tears. Both realized that escape was impossible for them. Back at the villa, Yunha was immediately led to the prince. The man sat towering over her and reprimanded her for returning later than he had authorized. He grinned and said that it looked as if his words were nothing to her, and that she was just mocking him. The girl knelt down and began to apologize to the lord. She said she was ready to do his bidding and stay with him as long as he wanted. Seo Ji-hak stepped forward with interest. Una trembled, holding back tears. She said she was ready to give up her salary. All this she was willing to do for her sister. She bowed her head and pleadingly asked if there was any way he could help her free her sister from the Kiseng house. Seo Ji-hak looked at the girl carefully and said that if he took her sister away, rumors would immediately spread that she would become his concubine. The people around him will brand him as a slutty nobleman who was involved with a parasite like Kiseng. Una didn't think of this outcome and was about to apologize for such a rash request, But suddenly she heard the man say that if that was what she wanted, then he was willing to do it. The girl froze in place, forgetting how to breathe. But in return, the young lord demanded that the girl sever all ties with her sister. He stated that the girl would not look for an opportunity to see her sister and would stay by his side for the rest of her life and be his eyes. He asked if she was ready to take such a step. Una meekly lowered her gaze. She knew it was stupid, but she didn't want to lose hope before the end. There was nowhere else to put it off. The girl stood up abruptly and apologized to the Lord for her words. She asked him to forget her request. Upon hearing such a thing, the man frowned. Yunha folded her hands in front of her and bowed slightly, saying that she needed to find a way out of this situation right now. So she apologized in advance for not being able to say goodbye to him properly. She said she would be indebted to him and would never forget his kindness. The girl turned round and said sadly that she would always keep the memories of him in her heart. She headed for the exit, and when she heard the man growl at her to come back and sit in front of him, she didn't stop. Suddenly, she felt a firm grip on her shoulder. And then, in an instant, the man shoved her against the wall so that her back hit the wall. Seo Ji-hak was breathing heavily and glaring angrily at her. He grabbed the girl by the shoulders and, seeing the fear in her eyes, calmed down a little, breathing out her name. He couldn't let her leave him. Then suddenly, rage came over him with renewed vigor. The man brought his face close to hers and asked, "How dare she speak to him like that?" Seo Ji-hak smirked and said that he had let himself be confused. He always knew that she was the type of woman who tries to act naive, but always seeks to consider only her own interests. The man looked at her menacingly and told her that he would honor her request and would not demand that she sever ties with her sister. Una looked at him fearfully, not yet realizing what was going on, until suddenly she heard the young lord announce that in return for his help, the girl will have to start to serve with another type of pleasure. Una knew what the man was talking about, but decided to try and trick him. She said she didn't quite know what she could do for him. The young lord put his hand on the girl's throat and began to tell how he had a little fawn as a child who trembled in his arms just as she did. Because the animal often cried, the servants took it to the forest and snapped its neck, saying it was the lord's fault for not taking good care of the pet. In this way, the man learned to always take responsibility for his actions and to rely only on himself. The girl tried to object, saying that no animal, slave, or even kiseng would be happy to be deprived of their freedom, so maybe that was the problem. The prince smirked and replied that it was in his power to change her into whatever he wanted. Seo Ji-hak hovered over the girl and asked if she thought someone like her would be able to manage her life on her own. The girl looked with empty eyes as if through him. The man exhaled and wondered if she would show a little goodwill and share her thoughts with him. Una shared with him that when she ran back to him, all she could think about was that he was the wealthy lord of these lands, and how much she would benefit when she came into his full possession. Those were the silly thoughts going through her head. Seo Ji-hak stared at her in surprise. The girl foolishly thought the forfeiting her life and freedom was worth it. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The girl raised her big eyes to the man and said that she would do anything to make her, him, and her sister happy. Her selflessness amazed the man. Deep down, he was afraid that the girl would refuse and he would lose her. Suddenly, he pulled her tightly against him and kissed her passionately. Unha felt the man turn her around, and then they both collapsed to the floor. Seo Ji-hak felt a slight pain and ran his hand over his lip to find that the girl had bitten him bloody. But it didn't make him angry, but rather intrigued him. He grinned and took off his shirt, making himself more comfortable. Until the first rays of the sun, Yunha felt alive time after time, and the man was full of pride that he was able to give her this feeling, the sweetest secret that will forever remain in her heart. The following morning, the servants walked around the courtyard as usual, carrying out their duties. Suddenly, everyone froze as the young lord came out of his chambers, gently holding the unconscious Yunha. Seo Ji-hak turned to Yulje and told him to get ready to go to the kissing house. The estate manager heard the servants begin to whisper about what was going on and gave everyone his stern look. He ordered the servants standing nearby to go and tidy up the lord's room, while keeping their tongues behind their teeth. The man turned around and began to think about what had come over his master and why he was suddenly so attached to this girl. He urgently needed to intervene, or the lord would forget the reason he had come here in the first place. Meanwhile, Seo Ji-hak went to the bathroom while continuing to carry the girl in his arms. The servant girls, who had been ordered to clean the lord's chambers, opened the doors and gasped. The whole room was torn apart, things strewn about, and some of the furniture broken, as if a tornado had swept through the room. After a while, the young lord and Yulja arrived at the Kiseng house. The elder Kisang obediently bowed to the prince, explaining that Yongi had always been a woman who traded her body and brought very good money to her mistress. She didn't want to give him one of her girls. The man sipped his sake nonchalantly and calmly replied that if the woman didn't give it to him, he would make her business go bankrupt. He went on to say that he was only asking her for one girl, and that the woman should be grateful that he wasn't demanding anything more than that. The woman obediently bowed and again tried to dissuade him, saying that a girl like Yongi would be of little use to him. Seo Jihak replied that he made a deal with this low girl's sister. Yuna promised to serve him without objection in exchange for her sister's release. The girl is constantly worried about her sister's fate, and this leads to him becoming upset that Yongi was her weakness. The man smirked and said that he was aware that the woman was charging him more than the usual visitors, and that it also played a part. He ordered that the girl be brought to him immediately, and then he would let Kiseng continue to lead her lowly life. Mistress, insulted by this attitude, was silent, but her brain was feverishly thinking what else she could do to change his mind. Finally, she said that the father of the two girls died because he crossed the wrong person. The blood he spilled in front of them hasn't been washed away yet. The woman advised the man to learn from the mistakes of the two girls' past, because what he does is not much different from what their father did. Seo Jihak banged his fist angrily so that the woman fell silent and was afraid to continue talking. He strictly said he knew Yunha better, but the elder Kiseng smirked slyly and asked if it was true. She went on to say smugly that there was not a single person in the country who knew the girl's father better than she did. He was a bastard who liked to touch her girls. He was a nobody, and he died in shame in front of his own daughters. The woman went on to say that Seo Jihak must have been aware of the case, because if she remembered correctly. Before she could say anything, the door opened and the Lord entered the room. The man immediately ordered her to shut her mouth and get away. The mistress stopped talking and froze in surprise. The elderly man in turn bowed and greeted Seo Jihak. The prince watched them with interest and smirked. The elderly man sat down and bowed. He began to ask the prince's forgiveness for his wife's disrespectful behavior. Seo Jihak smirked and replied that this woman did not disrespect him yet, but she was close to it. He said he'd be lenient with her provocative speeches, but just this once. The lord bowed gratefully to the prince. The man said he had been informed of the young lord's demand. It is an honor for their house of Kiseng to prepare a room for the prince to meet the girl. He said he would personally see to it that the Kiseng he chose was brought to the prince, and that they would take care of everything so that he would be comfortable spending time with new concubine. Seo Jihak interjected, "Why did the elderly lord call Yongi a concubine?" The man explained that this girl and his son had recently fallen in love with each other, and he had to take her into the family as a concubine for his son. As a caring father, he wants to keep an eye on them personally because he is worried about their future. Since the concubine status is quite respectable in society, the man asked the prince not to spread the word that he was allowed to spend time with her. Seo Jihak fakely smiled and said that the man is very influential in the city. That's why there are so many rumors about this girl among the people lately. He purposely started spilling tea past the cup, pretending not to see anything, and kept saying that he had been hearing excuses from the man since the beginning of the conversation. He asked him what he could say about the awful taste of the tea. The lord realized that the prince was angry, but could not argue with him openly. He turned to the servant and asked him to bring fresh tea. The man tried to smooth things over by saying that despite the girl's new status, they agreed to organize a meeting with her and asked him to accept this as a sign of hospitality. But Seo Jihak smirked and interrupted him by saying that it was a bullshit. He asked what self-respecting man would lick the boots of a blind man in such a manner. Does he have so little respect for himself or his son? It seemed ridiculously stupid. The prince asked if the lord of this house had fallen so low that he was trying to keep a mere Kiseng from him, making her his son's concubine. Unha sat in her room and lay her head sadly on her knees. Suddenly, Gari came in with a large bundle of things in her hands and said that she had come to visit her, as she had heard that the girl had refused food. She sat down in front of her and asked if she wanted something to eat, but Yunha smiled weakly and declined. The girl exhaled heavily and complained about their lord's behavior. Then she held out the letter to Yunha and said that the scholar had asked her to give this to her. The girl was surprised, but immediately opened the letter and began to read it. And from the first lines, she recognized native handwriting. Yoon wrote about sending her things he collected for her, but no longer sees the point in keeping them. He said to either throw them away or use them. The young man said that all his intentions to help her are now futile. Una couldn't believe he'd do that to her. At the end of the letter, he wished her well and asked her to remember that the place she was living in was like a lion's den, and she should be careful. She noticed among things a scroll with a poem she had written for him. Gari asked if the scholar was the young lord the girl had served before. Una was gripped by panic and despair. Had Yoon abandoned her to her fate so easily? She remembered how on his birthday she had written that very scroll with a poem for him. She was embarrassed because she wasn't very good at it, but she did it out of the goodness of her heart. Yoon was so happy and grateful then. He pressed her gift to his heart and said that it would be more precious to him than the most expensive gift he would ever receive. The girl held back tears, couldn't believe what was happening, thought it was a mistake. Suddenly, heavy footsteps were heard and the door of her room swung open loudly. The girl's eyes glazed over in horror. Seo Ji-hak entered the girl's room and stared at her. He noticed with what fear she clutched the scroll and looked at him with shocked eyes, as if she wanted to hide it from him. The man approached the girl and sat down silently across from her. Then, continuing to look into her eyes, he calmly pulled the scroll from the dazed girl's hands. Seo Ji-hak threw it on top of the other items. His gaze hardened, and he ordered the servants to burn every single item. Una came out of her daze and begged him not to do it. But the man propped his head up with his hand and looking into her eyes asked if she was really so presumptuous that she would defend gifts from another man by looking straight into his eyes. He asked if these things were so important to her just because they were from that man. Una shrieked that he had misunderstood and kept begging him to listen to her. Seeing that the servants had taken every single thing and even Gari had to leave the room, the stumbling girl was about to run after them. Suddenly, she felt a firm grip on her arm. The young lord asked her not to leave. The man softened his gaze and looked at her pleadingly. He asked her again not to run after them and leave him behind. The girl looked at him in confusion. Her heart and mind argued with each other, but finally she pulled her hand out and apologized to him, saying she agreed to all his terms, but not this one. Seo Ji-hak sat on the floor of the empty room, clenching his fist and staring at the girl as she walked away. In the middle of the courtyard, a bright fire was consuming all the items given to Unha. Gari peered round the corner and thought what a loss it was. So many beautiful and expensive things just destroyed. Even for their young lord, such an act was too much. Suddenly, Una rushed past her. The girl ran straight towards the fire. She was about to touch the burning scroll with her hand when suddenly she felt someone embrace her and pull her away from the burning flames. The girl fell straight onto Seo Ji-hak. The man was breathing heavily and continued to hold her close to him as he looked at her. He scrutinized her face and then ducked his head with concern and said that she should be ashamed of herself for continuing to do stupid things without thinking of the consequences. Events unfolded many years ago under the cover of night. The girl stood and watched in cold blood as the man was executed and his children beaten without regard to pleas for mercy. She noticed her younger brother looking at the little girl compassionately, but knew he wouldn't dare help her. Seo Ji-hak saw a child in front of him who was desperately trying to prevent the execution. The battered girl continued to look at them pleadingly, and even though there were tears in her eyes, she didn't give up. He pressed his lips together, unable to do anything to help her. Later, he caught up with his sister and angrily asked her how she could so brazenly slander innocent people. He accused her of it, saying she did it on purpose to divert attention from her own vices. The girl turned round to face her brother and said sternly that it was none of his business. Reluctantly, the boy asked why she did it. The girl folded her arms across her chest and exhaled, saying that it was because of the content of the books the man was reading. She said she didn't want to disturb him or the madam they were visiting. Just as people spread rumors, books can contain a lot of dangerous and false information, so she had to act. Seo Ji-hak called her dangerous and devious. The girl only smirked. Back in the room, Una tried to explain herself to the young lord again. But before she could say anything, Seo Ji-hak turned round, drew her to him, and kissed her passionately. The man was burning with jealousy. He pulled away from her and stroked her cheek gently. The man said regretfully that she must have really loved the young man very much to be willing to throw herself into the fire for his gifts. He was bitter about it and worried about her. He said she shouldn't have taken such a risk. Seo Ji-hak took her face in his palms and, looking into her eyes, hopefully asked her who she was thinking about in the bathroom the night she was with him. Unha realized with horror that what had happened was not a delusion or a dream. It had actually happened in reality. But she could not admit to him that she had seen him at that moment. She remembered what he had done to her, and her cheeks flushed. The man drove her crazy, but she had no idea how to tell him something like that. Without waiting for her answer, the man exhaled and said he would behave as naughty as she did and fell to his knees in front of the girl. Una covered her mouth with her hand to prevent a cry of surprise from escaping her lips. She stared at the man and asked why he was doing this. The girl felt embarrassed. Her master was kneeling in front of her. Seo Jihak looked up at the girl and said that if she wanted him to, he would do his best to serve her. Then he suddenly pulled her down and the girl landed in his lap. The man brought his face close to hers, gently touching her nose, and playfully said that she was wasting her time not wanting him to stay downstairs. He hugged the girl, enjoying her scent, and informed her that her sister was no longer a Qisheng. He had fulfilled his promise to her, so now she would have to keep her word as well. As he whispered in her ear, the girl thought that his sweet speeches are meant to penetrate people's hearts. But in these moments, he sounds so sweet she wants to believe it. Una tried to look directly at him to enjoy the sight of him. The man caught her gaze and said that he wanted her eyes to reflect him always, as they did now, and only him in them. The girl's hanbok fell to the floor. Seo Jihak took her by the chin and before kissing her said that she was his woman now, and no one in this world would make her feel the emotions he would make her feel. Deep in the night, the man was looking out the window and enjoying the silence of the night. Suddenly, a shadow appeared outside the door of the room. Yulja told the Lord that the food he had eaten earlier at the Qisheng house was not poisoned. He had checked it all out. The man thanked him and replied that apparently his time to die had not yet come. Yunha was sleeping peacefully beside him at the same time. Suddenly, the girl began to mumble her sister's name and tears flowed from her eyes. Seo Jihak noticed this and froze. Even in her dream, she was more worried about her sister than herself. He reached out and gently brushed away a tear, whispering words of comfort to the girl. Then he ordered Yulje to keep an eye on Qisheng. As he is sure the idea of her marrying young Lord Yoon seems to him Asbird, the old lord is up to something. The servant nodded in agreement. The prince covered the girl and whispered to her not to worry. She had to keep playing the role of bait, but he wouldn't let anyone hurt her no matter how hard they tried. He wanted to be the only man in her life. The next day in Lord Yoon's hanok, the servants whispered about the arrival of a young girl. They discussed that she had been sent by the elder Qisheng, probably as a concubine for the young lord. One of the servants declared that she was the most popular and desirable Qisheng in town. Yoon was standing nearby and hiding behind the wall, eavesdropping on the servants' conversation. He remembered a recent conversation with his father. The old lord summoned his son and told him that he should not treat the girl differently. He only allowed her to be his son's concubine to spite the prince. He had originally planned to punish this Qisheng and interrogate her, but the situation had turned in their favor. Yoon listened attentively to his father and clenched his fists in despair. He was helpless at the moment. Now he was thinking about how long would he be powerless to do anything, and how long would his father and his minions be focused on the girl. Meanwhile, Seo Jihak and Eunha went for a walk in the town again. The girl glanced at the man every now and then, but they walked in silence. She thought about the fact that he had been so angry with her yesterday that he still wouldn't let go of her hand, afraid she would run away from him again. The girl plucked up courage and told the young lord that among the things he had ordered to be burnt yesterday was a poem she had written herself. And as silly as it sounds, it was the only thing she wanted to save, for she had worked hard to write it. Una looked the man in the eye and said that if he wanted to punish her, she was willing to accept it. She heard him reluctantly. Seo Jihak smirked. He wasn't going to punish her. Truth be told, he was hoping the girl would start talking about her sister again. There was no way he was expecting this. However, he tilted his head to the side and said that it was now dangerous for Youngie to be near him. But the girl shouldn't worry because her sister is in a comfortable and safe place. The man then added that even if he bought her sister out and brought her to live with Eunha, he wouldn't want the girl constantly running around him and thanking him endlessly for what he had done. Una tried to object, but suddenly they passed people who were talking about some girl from the Qisheng house who had moved into a private villa. She tried to question the prince about it, but he acted calmly and told the girl to keep going and not to stop. At last, they found themselves in the back of a cloth shop. The owner came out to meet them and greeted them. Seo Jihak asked if everything he had asked for was ready. The woman, smiling and feeling a little intimidated by the high-ranking client, nodded and replied that she had done everything he had asked for. He looked at the dumbfounded Eunha and said he wanted her to have the best clothes, and ordered the woman to work with enthusiasm because he would not accept a result that was not good enough. Una was surprised that the man decided to buy her new clothes. She had never had anything like this before. Everything looked so expensive and beautiful. The woman knew Eunha, So as soon as the young lord moved away, she immediately asked if she was all right and if he was treating her well. The girl confusedly replied that she was fine. As soon as the woman started saying that there were terrible rumors going around the streets, a man appeared behind her back and said menacingly that he had only asked her to dress the girl. Seo Jihak stated that he had not brought her here to discuss useless things and ordered her to collect their purchases as soon as possible. Later that evening, when Eunha was reading to the young lord, she couldn't help thinking that the seamstress had tried to tell her something. But because Seo Jihak had interrupted her, she never found out what. It looked like something terrible was going on. As the man listened to her in silence and closed his eyes, she wondered what he was hiding from her. Suddenly picking up a new book, the girl realized it wasn't in a Western language. It was Cheong Siok's ancient poem, Bamboo in the Snow. The girl began to read the poem and noticed how closely the man began to follow her. When she had finished, she asked if the young lord was cold. He propped his head up with his hand and asked if she was asking him about it because she herself was cold to him. The girl was indignant and replied that she was worried because a cold wind was blowing outside. As snowfall had begun, the harshest season for all living things would soon begin. Seo Jihak quoted lines from the poem. There was a time when that cold wind was really harsh. People were perishing under the falling snow, and it used to be my fault. And asked what thoughts they evoked in the girl's mind. He wondered if she was a ruler and read something like this, how she would react. The girl exhaled heavily and replied that she would open her mind to take in the message and understand each verse. She would want to lead in country in the right direction, trusting in those qualities that make an emperor true. Suddenly, Una asked what kind of person Seo Jihak was. The man asked interestedly what she meant, and the girl replied that she was honestly trying not to pay attention. And she honestly tried to focus on reading books to achieve her goal and get the promised reward. But as time went on, it became clear that she was having a hard time pretending. She's sure the prince isn't completely blind, and he obviously doesn't need a personal reader. So why is she here? She wanted an honest answer directly from him. Seo Jihak listened attentively to the girl and remained silent. The man silently got up from his seat and walked over to the girl. She lowered her head in anticipation of righteous anger. Unexpectedly, the young lord ran his palm over her cheek and held her chin. He smirked and said he hadn't expected the girl to be so interested in him. The man ran his finger over her lower lip and said that if she wants to get answers, will she be able to handle what it takes to get it? Una lowered her head in thought. She was determined. When she defiantly looked up at the prince and replied that she could handle it, a satisfied smirk appeared on his face. He ducked towards her so that their noses were almost touching. The girl opened her mouth in anticipation. The man thought to himself that it was getting harder to embarrass her. He suddenly smiled sweetly and said he didn't want to tell her anything. Yunha stared at him in amazement. Teasing her turned out to be so much fun. Seo Jihak pinched her cheek and said cheerfully that if she was so interested, she should try to find out for herself. He then walked around the girl and said he would even give her a prize if she found out the truth. The girl asked him if he was joking. It was the first time she'd seen him so carefree. Seo Jihak sat down on the floor and made himself comfortable. He said that he really liked their current idol and didn't want to ruin it on purpose. The man lay down at the girl's feet and put one hand under his head and smiled sincerely, and said that he wanted to spend time with her like this, calmly and talking every day. He confessed that since going blind, he had discovered the true beauty of sounds, such as the rustling of leaves, the gusts of wind, the cries of animals in the mountains. And here in the villa, the sound of someone's footsteps, always quick and frivolous. At the last words, the man smiled slyly at the girl, his eyes playing with laughter. Una blushed and was embarrassed. She thought about how the steps could be frivolous. The girl suddenly asked if he had ever heard a tiger sneaking around. The man admitted he didn't. Then the girl told him that the tiger is the master in these mountains, and he always sneaks around almost inaudibly and can be heard when it is too late to run away. So when this beast hunts, everything in the forest is quiet. All the small animals are hiding. Seo Jihak began to play carelessly with the ribbon of her hanbok and asked if she had ever seen a tiger. When the man touched her lightly with his knuckles, the girl blushed a little, but continued to tell him that she had often spent time with hunters and had learnt to shoot guns and bows. She did not hunt tigers, but often acted as a bait. Seo Jihak thought it was ironic that she was acting as bait again, only this time without realizing it. Suddenly, he stood up abruptly and said that such desirable bait as she was hard to find, and then kissed the girl. Pulling away from her, he smiled and asked her to stay with him that night. He said he was afraid of the sudden appearance of a tiger and grinned. It was the middle of the night. Eunha slept soundly while the man admired her. The girl was sleeping peacefully, her long eyelashes touching her cheeks, her breasts rising and falling evenly. Seo Ji-hak gently stroked her hair and face, thinking about how unbridled and naive she was at the same time. His thoughts were interrupted by Yulja's voice announcing that Lady Hee-jin had arrived at the residence. The prince reluctantly stood up. It was necessary to greet his guest. After a while, Seo Ji-hak was quietly drinking tea, while opposite his sister was drilling him with a glare. Breaking the silence, the man asked why she had come to him so early at dawn and demanded a meeting. The princess asked if he had regained his sight. Staring off into the distance, the man replied that sometimes he could see nothing, and sometimes he could see the outlines of objects. Sometimes he sees quite clearly, and then a few days only darkness. The girl apologized for the awkward question. Hee-jin begged her brother to return to the palace. Their younger brother is still too young. If he's crowned, there's bound to be a rebellion in the country. The girl cried out in despair that the aristocrats are already on the verge of civil war, just waiting for the moment to tear each other's throats out for power. Seo Ji-hak smiled indulgently and replied that he thought his sister had come to visit him because she was worried about his health, but it seems he was mistaken. Offended, the princess shouted that she was worried about him as he was not answering her letters, to which the man replied that his life was in danger so he could not do so. Hearing this, the girl asked, "Who dared to attack the royal heir?" Seo Ji-hak smirked and looked his sister in the eye and said that she knew exactly where his dirty blood came from. The girl clenched her fists in despair and began to prove to her brother that all these rumors were groundless. That such foul rumors are always stuck to noblemen like him. The man smiled tiredly again and asked, "If these rumors were unfounded, shouldn't it have been worth it to find those who spread them and punish them and stop it?" Hee-jin froze and asked what he was talking about. The prince confidently replied that he was talking about his father. His own father had been so afraid of his sons taking over his throne since his birth that he had personally spread dirty rumors about him. One day, among the nobility began to spread rumors that all children born in the palace is the fruit of infidelity, Empress. The mere thought of allowing such a child to take the throne equated to dooming the entire country. And thanks to these dirty rumors, a lot of people have died. A servant who mistakenly ate poisoned food meant for the prince, his mother who killed herself in front of him, even his precious innocent fawn. Therefore, Seo Ji-hak was no longer interested in politics. The prince exhaled the smoke while holding the kiseng in his hands and looking into the distance, and then calmly said that whether the emperor wanted it or not, he would have to wait for his legitimate son to grow old enough to take the throne. Hee-jin stared at her brother in horror and stammered out an excuse for their father. She tried to reassure her brother that he had misunderstood, that all these rumors could be stopped. Without turning round, the man replied that after all he had been through, he had no doubts about what he had said. He was finally at peace. The girl decided not to give up and said she would stay in the village for a few more days and hoped her brother would change his mind and visit her. She turned around and headed for the exit. As she left, she said that their uncle had also sent his regards to Seo Ji-hak, but the man silently continued to smoke kiseng and didn't even turn around. Suddenly, the princess heard the two girls talking and stopped. Gari nudged Eunha and said that the girl must eat or the young lord would be angry. Hee-jin asked the estate manager who the girl was and what her name was. The elderly man replied that she was the lord's personal servant and her name was Eunha. Hearing that name, the princess only muttered that she knew they were bound to meet again sooner or later. Eunha ate her breakfast and went out of the kitchen, wiping her mouth with a napkin. She was glad she had a good night's sleep. The girl leaned her back against the door and thought that she should wait for the right moment. For now, she would have to take care of her health. She remembered how Yonggi had tried to persuade her to give them another chance to try and live a happy life. Eunha realized that she hadn't heard anything else from her sister since that day. Before the day she'd met the Lord, she'd wanted to get out of here by any means necessary, but now she realized that it had been impossible from the start. Those who kept them in this place had put her and her sister in tight shackles and would not let them go. They had nowhere to go. Eunha trusted her lord and believed that he had sent her sister to safety. So far, he hadn't broken any of his promises, so they would just have to wait for the right opportunity and not hurt themselves until they could do something about it. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange sound. She stepped outside the villa gates and looked around. The sound seemed to her to be coming from somewhere around here. Suddenly, she saw Horim leaning over another guard behind a stone. She noticed that the man was bleeding and tried to shout in horror, but Horim put a finger to his mouth and looked at her threateningly. The man turned round and gazed into the woods. The striped orange and black face of a huge tiger appeared from behind a tree. The animal came out of its hiding place with a low growl and looked straight at them. To be continued.